Every year, some of the biggest names in fashion gather in one place to discuss one of the biggest and most controversial topics happening in the industry right now: sustainability. Conferences like the Global Fashion Summit are both widely celebrated and criticized for what they do and don't achieve. Mostly it's people in the industry doing the former, and activists and NGOs and the public doing the latter. I wanted to see firsthand what one of these events were like, what goes on behind closed doors, what is discussed at these tables, and what actions come out of all of this talking. Those are my personal motivations, but I also wanted to make this event as transparent as possible, because unless you have a spare 900 euros to attend or 500 euros to stream this conference from home, you're probably not going to get an in-depth and honest breakdown on what happened over those few days that doesn't come from someone in the industry with a vested interest in making you think they're making a lot of progress in this area. That's why I flew to Copenhagen, sat through multiple days of people talking, and I'm now recording this video discussing what I saw to make this information accessible to everyone. So let's talk about what it was really like. Before we get into it, welcome back to my channel. My name's Katie. I talk about sustainable fashion and often bring that into wider cultural conversations. If that sounds good to you, then subscribe to the channel and come hang out with me on my other social medias, but especially Instagram, where I do call out posts that you can get involved with for these videos. And with that, let's begin by talking about what this year's Sustainable Fashion Conference was about. The theme this year was barriers and bridges. And before the event even took place, there was a threat of controversy, courtesy of the organizer of the event, GFA, being linked to Copenhagen Fashion Week, which is currently facing legal allegations of greenwashing. I was curious to know if this would be addressed at all during the conference, and spoiler alert, it wasn't. But it kind of checks out that this somewhat big news wasn't on the agenda. Like I said, the general perception of these events is that it's nothing more than the industry getting together to pat each other on the back or using the guaranteed press coverage to tactfully announce new sustainability ventures and initiatives, while somewhat glossing over pressing issues and the lack of sustainability progress the industry can show for having multiple events like this spanning multiple years. This criticism is something sustainable fashion conferences like the GFS is well aware of, and I found that it kind of hung over every conversation happening like a weird shadow. The speakers and the panelists certainly seem interested in convincing us that they were trying to do something. I don't know how many times I heard the phrase, "We need to stop talking and instead take action," over those few days I was at the conference. But let's start talking about the conference and digging into the key moments. I think the opening speech was a really good insight into the industry's behavior towards sustainability going into the GFS. The kind of themes and issues immediately mentioned were the importance of transparency in fashion, even in the face of increasing sustainability criticism and greenwashing allegations, the need for the industry to find a new narrative to push sustainability as the old one has been falling on deaf ears, according to them, and how the industry can remain hopeful in the face of very turbulent times. Tariffs, new legislation, and supply chain scandals like the Made in Italy were specifically mentioned. The topics for every year do vary, and I think they're very heavily influenced by the issues facing the industry at that specific point in time. And this year, there was definitely a wide range of issues being covered on the agenda. I had talks on things like circular fashion, biomaterials, the rise of pre-loved, fair pay for garment workers, and fashion's carbon footprint. There were also specific talks about tariffs, the rise of AI, and how fashion can close the consumer gap, which I was most interested in attending when I saw the schedule beforehand. Not only because I do feel like they were the buzziest topics happening in fashion, but they're also things I cover a lot on my channel, so I have a personal interest in hearing about the industry's takes on them. But they didn't actually end up being my favorite moments from the conference. All of my favorite moments actually came from other panels that felt really genuine. I think a great example is when the co-founder of Veja Trainers was on stage. Not only was he openly disparaging towards big companies like H&M, he was very blunt in his delivery of not understanding why fashion can't fix its own issues. In his mind, the people in the room that were listening to him are putting too much priority on advertising and unsustainable growth and don't have enough focus on the actual products they're making. One of the buzziest words for this conference was the idea of a brand's values. But when the co-founder of Veja was questioned what his company's values are, he just kept saying they didn't have any. They just took action. And there was like this palpable tension tension and awkwardness in the room that I felt was really, really interesting. Some of my other favorite moments came from leaving the main stage of the conference and going to the smaller rooms, where they had things like table discussions that encouraged us to talk to other people in the industry and try to workshop solutions to key issues. Like for one panel I attended, we were encouraged to find solutions to making circular fashion more accessible and more attractive to consumers. And I really like the collaborative and creative aspect of this. It felt like probably the most productive time at the conference. Of course, hosting a live event, there were definitely things that went wrong, and there were definitely moments that felt a little bit controversial, a little bit awkward, and I kind of want to go over some of them. For example, at a few of the panels, some of the speakers felt the need to stop the discussion and say, hey, let's take a step back. Let's provide context on why sustainability is important, or let's think about why we're talking about this in the first place. And everyone in the room is well aware of how important sustainability is. That's why we're in this room. So it felt so unnecessary. It massively broke up a discussion, and it kind of just felt like a time waste, or like they didn't know what to say. So they were just saying like, hey, let's pause while I think of something. Multiple times this happened through the conference. It kind of became a little bit of a joke. There was also this weird moment right towards the end of day one where a panel was being hosted called What is Next Gen, looking at the future of fashion. And the host of this panel asked a random audience member to come up who was under 25. And once this volunteer come forward, the host proceeded to ask her really weird, really random questions that kind of felt a bit like she was trying to find a gotcha moment. She was asking things like, do you like shopping? The girl answered no, but there was this weird moment where everyone was like, why are you asking this? And obviously it's live, so the audience was kind of sat there confused. The panelists were a little bit confused. That panel was a whole mess. That was probably the messiest one. So many more examples I could give, to be honest, of best moments and controversies, but I feel like we should move into my takeaways from the event. Probably the biggest one and the easiest one to start with is, just like was foretold, there was too much talking and not enough action. Despite how often 2030 was brought up and the fact that we're only 5 years away from this deadline, a lot of brands have committed to show tangible, meaningful progress towards sustainability, it still felt like so much of the time on stage was dedicated to talking about making progress rather than actually how people can make progress. I think the first panel of the conference was the perfect example of this. Obviously, given that this was the first couple of hours of the conference, I wasn't expecting anything too groundbreaking, but I wasn't expecting just how many empty words there would be. It was a panel being monitored by the head of innovation, research, and demonstration at H&M. And the amount of time she said the phrase, we need to get into the nitty-gritty when talking about sustainability, was honestly laughable. I literally noticed a few people in the audience scoffing when she'd said it for the 5th time, and we'd still yet to actually move past that phrase and talk about something actionable. Which kind of brings me on to one of the main issues I noticed over these few days. The conference was at times painfully surface level, and slightly worse, a lot of the discussions happening on stage were unbalanced. I think one of the weirdest moments for me was during a panel called Beyond Fashion, where the guests talking were asked to define what sustainability means to them. Surely we're past this. Sustainability is not a subjective term. It should be a standardized language that fashion follows in order not to have issues like greenwashing. And this was a running theme throughout the conference. Panelists and hosts spending time explaining concepts that people in the room were well aware of, given that this is literally their job. It's literally their job to know what the attitude behavior gap is. I found it so hard to understand why they were wasting time explaining these things when they could have been diving into solutions. I guess overall, I kind of just felt like there wasn't much urgency with these conversations. We had time to go around the houses and explain concepts that people were well familiar of, and by the time we actually got into something interesting, the panel was kind of over. Interestingly enough, I kind of got the impression that a lot of the panels were scripted in some way or pre-rehearsed, and that a lot of the guests had pre-approved points that they wanted to hit or stick to, which the hosts were well aware of and kind of guided them into being able to do that. And often it felt like you were listening to a press release rather than a genuine discussion between colleagues in an industry. Like, the discussions on stage didn't feel very organic in that way. It didn't feel like there was real room to challenge each other and, riff off each other. It was just kind of like, oh yeah, and you wanted to say this and you wanted to say that for a lot of them. I wouldn't say all of them, but for a lot of them. I came away quite disappointed with the content of a couple of panels. And I was actually scrolling through the press photos for the conference in preparation for this video when I got back. And I found this really funny photo of me taken at the AI panel. I could definitely see why they included this in the press pack because I look so focused. But unfortunately for the organizers, I'm not sitting there in like contemplation mode thinking, wow, this panel's so good. I'm learning so much. I'm making this face because I'm wondering who thought that this discussion that's basically just some brands promoting their AI services would be useful in talking about AI's role in fashion. I'm also sitting there thinking, who on earth approved a panel full of CEOs of AI companies without also thinking, hey, maybe we should put someone who's not in AI so that it could be marginally balanced and there will be someone there to give an outside perspective on this issue. There was hardly anything that really interested me in that panel, despite the fact that it was one of the ones I was desperate to go to when I saw the program. The only interesting moment was actually created by the audience, who in this discussion could send in their questions for the panelists to see at the end and address. And the top question that was voted for by the most people to be answered was, how do we mitigate the environmental damage of AI? Something that hadn't been addressed in the panel and had just been skirted over. It was interesting that the crowd had to be the one to bring up this obviously very important point. But then one of the speakers who had to kind of take the question, basically his argument was just that AI can improve AI. So we should just ask AI how to fix the environmental damage of AI. And honestly, the reaction in the room was pretty funny. I think it was just kind of like, did you just say that? Okay, and also just real quick before we move on to some other takeaways, I need to talk about the fact that, speaking of not addressing controversies at these conferences, the conference had so many H&M employees as guests or hosts of panels, and yet they couldn't get one of them to come along and talk on the AI panel about the fact that they've been pushing digital twins and how they back it as a necessary move towards progress and creativity. In fact, there was no addressing of how AI is creeping into the creative aspect of fashion at all. All of the companies that were on the panel worked in things like logistics and waste and consumer shopping areas of AI. Yet the creative aspect is probably the most interesting and controversial part. Okay, moving on. Another one of my big takeaways was that SponCon had too much influence over the proceedings. The summit is sponsored by a range of companies in the industry, and that was made very clear from how much sponsored content there was. You had like Nike doing wellness sessions and morning runs. There was a big brand featured on every other bloody panel. And specifically, I need to talk about how much time H&M got at this conference. Before we do, I want to preface it by saying that not every panel had a sponsored guest, and that I did enjoy some of the panels that did have a sponsored guest. And that I also understand that GFA is a non-profit organization that has to make their money in order to run these events. So, I'm not hating on the idea of brand partnerships entirely, even though ethically I feel like it does blur some boundaries. Specifically, my issue was with how far they allowed this sponsored aspect of the event to go. Like, for example, why are brands being allowed to moderate panels? Invite them into the conversations, sure, but giving them the power to chair these conversations is too much, in my opinion. I do think that the panels that were hosted by journalists or NGOs or, an unbiased person in the powerful seat were better panels. Even though you could tell they've been told to allow sponsors to talk or, mention big releases that they wanted to announce, they had much more control over the conversation. It was more interesting what they were discussing. And yeah, it didn't just feel quite so branded. I know I said I understand why brands are in these conversations, but I did have an issue with how much they monopolized the conversations, even when they weren't hosting. Every conversation with a brand in one of the guest chairs felt very unbalanced. They seemed to speak the most out of every other guest on there. Or like if there were two brands on the panel, it most of the time would be divided between them. And this is something other people echoed when I was talking to them in the breaks. So I don't think this was just me noticing. I have to go back to that Beyond Fashion panel that I mentioned, because I feel like it's a great example of how much these brands were allowed to monopolize these conversations, but also not be challenged on what they were saying. Like in this panel, the rep from H&M fully sat there and said things like, sustainability is part of our values, with no hint of a challenge from anyone else on stage. And actually, if we want to go through a couple of other examples from this panel, I do think they were really interesting and just keep keep proving my point, because there were so many things I took note of and kind of just thought if I was the one in that host chair, I would be challenging them. A great example, she said, we want to be able to grow as a company and create more products during a sustainability conference. Like, I would just be like, challenge, why do you want to create more products? Aren't you big enough already? Is your current production volume not enough? Another thing was her saying that they want consumers to tell us what they want from the brand and where they're going wrong. And, challenge, why are you going to wait for consumers and controversy to tell you where you're going wrong as a company? Surely that's something you should be able to figure out. And it is something they figured out, because with the digital AI twin controversy, they literally prefaced it by saying, we know this isn't going to please everyone. I said it before when I covered this, and I'll say it again here. It feels like a cop-out for us taking responsibility. One of the only times this rep from H&M was challenged was a really interesting time. She said something like, we welcome manufacturers and other brands to join us, H&M, on our sustainability journey, in response to a question about whose responsibility it is to improve sustainability in fashion. Right after she'd said this, one panelist kind of came back by saying that collaboration and progress towards sustainability should be about sharing profits and power. And I kind of felt that that was a great dig. Again, this was one of the only instances I saw of someone being challenged on stage. And even this was too polite for me. I wanted it to be a little bit more direct and kind of call her out on the fact that there's such a power imbalance in fashion. Those were kind of my main takeaways from the event. I want to rapid fire a couple of other ones that I think are really important, but we're not going to get into them quite as much. The first being, I felt that there was a real lack of focus on the humanity of the issues we were talking about during the entire conference. Like, for example, after that Beyond Fashion panel, once the next panel was introduced on the agenda, which was about jobs with dignity, talking about supply chains and the struggles of garment workers, specifically in Bangladesh, with a representative from someone who is a garment worker, half the audience left the auditorium, which I felt was quite telling. Bella Webb, who was hosting this panel and is a journalist for Vogue Business, if you're not aware, called this out really well, in my opinion. She said that all of the big picture discussions happening during the conference are often dehumanized, and that the environmental and social sides of ESG goals in fashion are often treated separately and unfairly. Obviously, this conference is full of people working in an industry that does have to make a profit if it wants to survive, but I don't think this has to be to the detriment of the human factor of sustainability. And I was really glad that Bella called it out. I just wish there had been more people left in the audience to hear it. I also would have liked to see more panels throughout the conference, including representatives for garment workers or supply chain workers, alongside the brands and industry professionals that were invited to speak, so that again we could have another opinion, someone who could challenge what brands are saying or just bring a new light to these topics, a new perspective. Okay, second quick fire takeaway. There was a real tension I noticed between the brands and panelists and what was being said on stage versus what the young people were saying in the audience and in the breaks where we could, sit down and discuss what happened. I ended up speaking to a lot of students or people just starting their career in fashion, and they were all saying the same thing, that the fashion industry as a whole and the discussions during this conference put too much emphasis on profits, growth, and commercialization. The only time I saw this kind of be addressed on stage was during the Next Gen Assembly, and they used their time on stage to convey this sentiment that I feel like all young people at the conference have been feeling. They asked the industry to stop putting profit above all else, to stop trying to fix a broken fashion industry and instead change the conversation into something more radical. Aditi Maya, who was hosting this conversation, I think summed it up really well. She said, young people aren't indoctrinated into our fashion system, and that's their best strength. This sentiment definitely seemed to resonate with a lot of the people attending, like I said. In fact, the only two times I personally saw the audience clap for something said on stage was when young people were given the chance to tell the fashion industry they need to reevaluate their priorities. Let's move on to the place this conference has in the fashion industry. Because this was a couple of days where hundreds, if not thousands, of sustainability professionals gathered into a room to talk about pressing issues. But the brands and professionals attending this event are the same ones who are cutting back on sustainability messaging and quietly rolling back targets that they set for 2030 or initiatives that many of them announced at these conferences only a few years back. They're also the ones who are increasing spending on government lobbying to manipulate or water down legislation that's trying to fix a broken fashion industry. Obviously, as a first-time attendee, I don't have much of a comparison to offer between this year's summit and previous years. I figured that these surface level conversations and somewhat somber mood of attendees was just what these things were like. But from talking with other people at the conference who had attended and reading some of the coverage that's come out since last week's event, it does seem that this year was noticeably different from others. According to Business of Fashion's Sarah Kent, the event is typically dominated by large brands offering up a relentlessly optimistic prognosis on the industry's climate efforts, but the tone was unusually downbeat this year. Even fashion can't put a positive spin on the current situation. During a couple of the breaks of the conference, I spoke to some of the brands that were showcasing their new initiatives, and a lot of them were actually lamenting that less brand representatives from fashion were attending this year compared to other years. And I wonder if that's indicative of the industry's focus on sustainability, or I guess lack of, due to how turbulent the rest of the industry is. Okay, I feel like we've covered what happened at the panel, some of the most exciting and controversial moments, but let's finish by talking about the conference itself and my thoughts on whether it's relevant or not. I came away from those 2 days feeling very drained, I can't lie. And my Patreon subscribers will be well aware of this because I covered my reaction to what happened on each day right at the end when I was about to go to bed in my hotel room. And I feel like every time I did, my mood was quite downbeat. So yeah, not a surprise to them that I genuinely just felt very drained coming back home from Copenhagen. I also wasn't left feeling very optimistic about the things I'd heard, or that any conversations had been very meaningful, or that any meaningful actions were going to be taken from those conversations. Again, I was just kind of struck with how surface level the entire conference seemed. It was less of a strategy session between well-informed individuals all in the same industry, and more of a reminder for brands that sustainability is a thing and we need to tackle it. Obviously, not all of the issues that I mentioned were the conference's fault. They can't be blamed for the industry's generational divide and the unwillingness from brands to disrupt the system, for example. But a lot of the issues I noted from this year's event linked back in some way to the structure or the planning, like discussions being unbalanced and weighted towards sponsors, or brands remaining unchallenged in what they said on stage. I do think this conference is necessary, if only to serve as a reminder for brands that sustainability is a big issue. And I personally took a lot away from it, not just the new experience of being in the same room as people with power to change the fashion industry, but I also got to meet a ton of lovely people, including a few subscribers who actually came up to me during the event, and it was so lovely to connect with them. So yeah, I personally took a lot away from the event, but I do think it has a lot of room to improve. Otherwise, where will the drive for change come from if the fashion industry is allowed to just pat each other on the back like this and move on? Okay, and with that, I feel like I've yapped enough about this event and my takeaways from it. I hope you enjoyed this video and it gave you a somewhat rare insight into these industry events. Let me know if you liked it and what other areas of the fashion industry you feel are inaccessible, and I can try open some doors here on the channel. Thank you guys so much for watching. Remember to like, comment, and subscribe to the channel, and I'll see you soon. Bye.